I'm going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Laura Quiros advises, coaches, and trains boards of directors, executives, and other professionals across the corporate, professional services, higher education, and nonprofit sectors to advance their efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion. For the past 12 years, Dr. Quiros has served as an associate professor of social work at Adelphi University, where she teaches social work practice at the doctoral and master's level. And beginning this September, on September 1st, Dr. Quiros will join Montclair State University Department of Social Work and Child Advocacy, which will situate Dr. Quiros in her community of Montclair, New Jersey, where she will continue to lead and be involved in anti-oppression work within the school system and the wider community. So we're really honored and pleased to have Dr. Quiros with us, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Clara, and thank you everyone for holding space today. It is a summer in July, the end of July. I want to just wish blessings to you and your family and your friends and your community, just in general. And before I even begin, I want to just ground you in love, because that's what today is about. And when I use the word love, I'm not using it as a noun, but I'm using it as a verb. Those of us who are familiar with the author who passed a year or two ago, Bell Hooks, talked about love, and love is a verb. And so one of the things I want us to get out of today is how can we bring that verb of love, that action of love, into our lives in the space of healing. And so, so we have a very short time to go over a heavy topic. And so this is just the beginning of this journey for some of you. And for some of you, you already know a lot about this topic. But for me, somebody that has done this work and continue to do this work, I am always in a space of learning. So I'm even in a space of learning with you today. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint in a minute, and how this is going to work. I always like to give my audience sort of the run of the show before we even start, so you know what to expect. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. I'm going to ground us in some community engagement offers, and I am going to then move us into back and forth between my own story around intergenerational trauma and also sort of definitions and a normalization of intergenerational trauma. And I really want to emphasize that if there's another thing I want you to get out of today, it's the normalization of intergenerational trauma, seeing trauma as a disconnection from the self, not as a place of deficit. I'm also hoping that in today's talk, we will start to unpack trauma and start to think about trauma, not only from an interpersonal space, but what I name as a socio-political space. So I can safely assume, I don't know everyone on this call. I see there's about over 200 people, which is amazing. And I could almost guess that all of us in the past 3 years have experienced some sort of trauma. And so with that comes a normalization of how can we create psychologically safe spaces for us to lean into this in a place of healing. And so I'm going to start to share my screen, and we're going to move through the PowerPoint together. I also want to say, as I begin to do this, that I'd love if you have a piece of paper, or you have your journal, or even if you have a phone, that you take notes. I'm very comfortable in the virtual space because we have to be, but I also often envision us sitting together in a circle, even though there's so many of us, and really doing this work together. So please have something to write with, or even just an open mind to really think about what's resonating with you as we move through our time together. So with my work, I always begin with a land acknowledgement, and it's important for me to tell you why. I begin with a land acknowledgement because of the erasure of trauma from certain communities, from certain groups of people. So I strive to make it my business that whether I am in my home in Montclair, New Jersey, whether I'm traveling, when I was at Adelphi, to know the land that I am on. because it was those people, it was those indigenous nations that ground me here today. And if we don't name that, we are also participating in erasure of trauma. And so I am calling in from the land of the Lenape. That's where Montclair, New Jersey is located on. And so I am just outwardly giving thanks for my indigenous nations for creating the space that I am today. And for those of you that don't know the land that you sit on, make that be your first fun activity to figure out, what land am I on? Who are my indigenous neighbors? Where did this come from? So we can start to think about how there were people before us whose history have been erased. So that's sort of the first thing I want to position us with today. The second thing is what I call community agreements. And whenever I do any sort of presentation or in my classes, no matter how big or small it is, I always like to ground us in ways that we are going to engage today. And granted, we don't have much time and it's not sort of an open dialogue, but we will have time at the end for Q&A. And so I want you to be mindful about the language you are using, even when you're asking questions. A lot of times when we talk about social justice, right, we move from an I to a they, or we move from an I to a we, and we don't own what we're saying. And so part of the work around our own agency is to own what we are saying. So try to think about in your daily practice, in your daily lives, how often you use I statements as opposed to we or they. Active listening. So again, we've already started, right? We started with Clara's introduction. We moved on to my introduction, to us grounding us in a place of love as a verb, talking about land acknowledgement. And so thinking about those moments when you start to stray away from the presentation and really try to listen with not only your ears, but with your heart and your soul as well. As Clara mentioned, we are going to be talking about an intense topic. And so there will be questions at the end. And so let's make sure that what's said in this space stays in this space. And if it comes out of this space, that it's used as a point of learning, not as a point of sort of telling on or telling about, right? That's the important thing about confidentiality. Making space and taking space. If you're a type of person or you're more quiet, but today you want to step in and ask a question, please do. Understanding that this work around social justice, around intergenerational trauma, around racial inequity brings up discomfort, right? It makes us feel uncomfortable in our bodies, and that's okay, because it's only through that discomfort that we can start to grow and really grapple with the things that need to be unpacked and also need to be healed. And I'm also going to be talking about this practice called use of self. And I will do this in the beginning when I talk to you about my own story. And this is just for those of you, all those of you in the helping profession that supervise or teach or hold circles or in any capacity, think about how you can use your own stories in a place of healing for others. Think about the ways in which you may experience trauma that can be seen as an opportunity for growth that you can share with others so they can start to feel comfortable sharing their own stories. Often we forget that we are our greatest tools, right? We look for interventions, we look for readings, we look in articles, but how often do we lean into our own stories as a way to healing for others? So I call that use of self. So I learned through my work, and I'll share with you sort of the very personal integration of how I did this. When I was looking at my own history of trauma, I found some studies, and a 2013 study validates that intergenerational trauma is passed down through generations. And more specifically, the intergenerational transmission of risk for neuropsychiatric disorders, such as anxiety and phobia and post-traumatic stress. Those are big words. So I want to start to unpack what that means. And in my own language, you know what that means? It means that things that have happened in my parents' generation, in my ancestors, in the countries from which they were born, in this own country, passed down through my DNA. Right? They live in my body. And sometimes they live in my body and they are completely unrecognizable. And it doesn't mean that it makes me deficient. It doesn't mean that it makes me dysfunctional. It doesn't mean that it makes me not able to. It means that I have ancestral history in me that sometimes shows up in the place of anxiety, that sometimes shows up in the place of fear. And if I'm able to name that and I am able to see that, I'm able to use that as a place of growth, not as a place of deficit. And so I'm going to stop sharing for 1 minute. And I decided I'm always, when I get asked to do these talks, it's always important for me to share a part of myself, even though I don't know the audience that I am at, because I am modeling. And so what happened was when Clara reached out for me to do this, at the same time, I was asked to write a book chapter for a human and behavior book. So in social work, we have human behavior in the social environment courses. And a lot of those traditional books, the theories in those books that talk about identity development, were written by white cisgendered men, right? Those identities do not fit my identity. And so while I was asked to do this book on decolonizing a human behavior text. And the chapter that I was asked to write on was adolescents with marginalized identity. And granted, I am a scholar in trauma, I am a DEI expert and consultant, but I never, until I was given this writing assignment, I never really tapped into what that meant for me. I knew about my ancestral history, but I didn't actually know about how that manifests for myself. And so I'm going to read you a little bit of this chapter just to ground you in my own story. And hopefully this sharing will resonate for you in certain ways, and it will let you tap into parts of yourself that you may not know. And so I begin by saying my mother and father were survivors of intergenerational trauma. I can attest to the transmission of intergenerational trauma that lived in me. But as an adolescent with a marginalized identity, the trauma and the manifestations of trauma were not named. Right. So back then when I was growing up, and I'll share more about my identity and my age in a second, I wasn't told, oh, Laura, you have intergenerational trauma. That's why you're acting like that. What I was told is I was given labels as unstable, labels as broken, labels as wild, out of control, too much, too emotional. Right. And so I was behaving and I was manifesting this trauma without protection, without safety, without really understanding what was happening to me. And so my history, my identity is that my mother, who passed away last year, was white and Jewish, and my dad is Black and Latino. And so growing up in a home with racism and anti-Semitism. And so my parents parented from their personal histories. When my dad came to this country from Puerto Rico, he was told very explicitly, you do not speak English. Right? My mother was told, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. My father was told, don't stay out in the sun too long because you'll get too dark. And those behaviors were unintentionally passed down to me. So when I was an adolescent, I straightened my hair because my hair wasn't good hair as it was, right? My brother and I never learned to speak Spanish because why would my father, who was so discriminated against because of his Puerto Rican and Black identity, teach us Spanish, right? And so my home was also filled with trauma, interpersonal trauma, not because my parents were bad, but because they were holding so much from racism, from being colonized, from being Holocaust survivors. And that all showed up in the way that they parented, right? And so I navigated my adolescence pretty much on my own with not much supervision or guidance. So if we looked at traditional theories on parenting, one might say that my parents were neglectful, that my parents were permissive, right? Because there was no understanding of their intergenerational trauma that my parents carried as parents, right? And so if we choose to lean on traditional theories, right, we're not accounting for the social hierarchies, right? We're not accounting for the racism and discrimination that affects particularly people with marginalized identities. And so my identity as a Black and Jewish Latina was situated in interpersonal and intergenerational and socio-political traumas. And so I name that because if we're not able to understand that sometimes the ways that we act were passed down through our DNA because of intergenerational trauma, were labeled as broken or as wild, as I was, right? And so I'm going to quote a man, Richard Schwartz. He does a lot of work in family therapy. And his quote really resonated for me. And what he says is when you tell a person they are sick, and ignore the larger context in which their symptoms make sense, not only do you miss leverage points that could lead to transformation, but you also produce a passive patient who feels defective. So I want you to take that in. And again, if we ignore the historical context, right, of racism, homophobia, xenophobia, ableism, all sorts of oppression, the focus just that's passed down through generation, the person just becomes deficit, the person just becomes broken, and there's no connection to larger systems. And that's really, really important for understand. So it wasn't even 35, 40 years later, right? 35 years later, while I'm sitting here today, I still am unpacking. I'm still unpacking layers from my own childhood in ways that trauma was passed down, because I'm a parent today. I have a 14-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter. And although I mess up all the time and I might yell and I might, put all sorts of pressure on them to perform, I have to stop myself and say, whoa, Laura, that's coming from somewhere else, And for me, the most important things about my parenting is that my parents know me as human. They know me as a person, not just as their parent. And when I mess up and when I flip out, or when I'm doing something, right, that comes from not a place of my essence, I need to hold myself accountable for that. And so my identity is one of a social worker, right? Like PhD, professor, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, I live in the space of social work. And my phrase for social work is that social workers are restorers of the soul. And the reason they're restorers of the soul is because it's my job as a social worker to first do my own healing. Because if I'm not doing my own healing, I can't show up in a space of sincerities for others, right? That I do my own healing. And then I help my clients, I help my communities, I help my students, I help my CEOs and my executive teams do their healing through restoring their essence and restoring their souls that may have been disrupted by intergenerational trauma. And so I'm going to share my screen again. And I want you, while we're sitting here, to think about what resonated for you in my story. What were the parts of my story that you felt that you could connect to? What were the parts of my story that you were reacting to? What were the parts of my story that you tuned out? And where does this live in your body? Because for me, I know like that trauma for me lives in my stomach. It lives in my head, right? Sometimes it lives in my anxiety. And I watch my 14-year-old who has anxiety, right? And I know it's part of it is passed through that DNA, because when I was pregnant and she was younger, I had so much anxiety that there's no way that there wasn't transmission, but that's okay, because I can name that and I can work on that with her, right? Instead of just ignoring it, that it doesn't exist. And also understanding that it comes from a larger context, not from me. And so that's sorry, I'm talking a lot. That's your homework, is to think about what story of intergenerational trauma do you want to tell from the place of healing. Now, I could sit here for the next 2 hours and tell you tons of stuff about my childhood and how I grew up and all of the traumas, but we don't have time to do that. I don't really want to do that. What I want is for you to think about the areas in your life that you have worked on, that you can start to share with other people so they can start sharing, right? And begin to heal, because we can only heal in community. We can only heal in relationship. And so what is our lens? When I say the word trauma, what is that definition? How are you defining it? For me, trauma is a disconnection from the self, right? And it took me, and I'm still on that journey, I'll always be on that journey, to find out who Laura is beyond all of those experiences, particularly those that happened in my adolescence, right? That were just my coping, just my manifesting the trauma that was in my home and passed down through generations, right? So it's the external event, and then it's the impact of the event. It isn't you. And I really want to make that clear. I tell my students all the time, they work with people that, they work in the mental health field, they work in the addiction field. And if there's one thing that I will come down very hard on them, is when they start to pathologize the client and they start to use labels and don't think about the fact that those behaviors, even substance abuse, are manifestations 99% of the time of trauma. And sometimes people don't even know how else to cope, right? So how do we move, again, love is a verb. How do we bring that into our practice? How do we bring that into our lives and start to connect these personal manifestations of trauma to larger systems of oppression in a way that we can heal? And so what happens is if we don't do that, and Gabor Mate is a wonderful psychologist that speaks to this, those manifestations become part of who we are. So when I was growing up and I was given those labels, I really thought, like even today, my friends would say, well, I don't experience you as unstable. I don't experience you as out of control. And I have to stop myself because I was like, oh, right, those are the manifestations from the trauma. And so how can we start to reframe how we think about trauma as a disconnection from the self? I also named in my talk when I was doing a reading this concept of socio-political trauma. And I really started to lean into this after the murder of George Floyd, because I wasn't seeing that racism, for example, was being named as a trauma. And I'm not only talking about present day racism, but I'm talking about the fact that, our country, United States, was founded on slavery. And there's tons of other examples across the world of the harm of colonization. And how could we not name that as trauma? Like, how could we not say that trauma is beyond just the interpersonal? Trauma is about being the only person of color in a white space. Trauma is about, people constantly getting your pronouns wrong, right? Trauma is about not being able to show up in the way that you want to show up because you were told to assimilate to a place that doesn't represent you. And so how do we think about trauma and the social determinant of mental health for individuals within a context, right? Because the trauma space, for the most part, was also really founded and grounded by white men. And so I want to raise the bar. I want to say that when we talk about trauma, we're also talking about socio-political trauma, the trauma of all of the oppressions and how that can live in us and how it manifests in the way that we show up with each other. And so this is also a quote that I love. I don't know those of you who know this concept of the weathering effect, but there was an article on it in NPR. And the researcher, whose name I should know, but I can't recall right now, talks about how when you're hit with oppression constantly, there's a weathering effect. Like when you think about cliffs and a beach and the shore or the water is constantly pounding on the beach and the rocks start to erode, that's a weathering effect, right? So when you're constantly being hit over and over again by racial disparity, by racial trauma, by intergenerational trauma, you start to weather, right? And so this is a quote that I also liked. Oppressed people are routinely worn down by the insidious trauma involved in day after day living in sexist, racist, classist, homophobic, ableist society, Googled by men on the streets, slaving long hours for minimal wages. I could go on and on and on. Right? And so how can we start to name socio-political trauma and make that part of the conversation? And so what do we do? Right? And I'm going to tell you what to do in 15 minutes. No, I'm not, because we could sit here for hours and talk about what to do. But seriously, like, what do we do with all of this? And so one of the things that I've thought about what to do with this is to really lean into what I call trauma-informed practice from a diversity, equity, inclusion lens. I wrote a book during the pandemic. Actually, as I said, I was really motivated by the lack of socio-political trauma as it related to the murder of George Floyd and all of the other things that were happening and continue to happen, right? They're constantly happening, hate crimes, gun violence, right? And I talk about how can we infuse the trauma world with a social justice lens. So we're not only looking at trauma from an interpersonal space, but we're actually really connecting mental health and individual mental health with systems of oppression so that people don't walk around in spaces of deficit, because there's no deficit, right? It's the impact, it's the disconnection from the self. And I really can't say that enough. And the other piece of around what we do is what I call radical self-care, because I really do think that self-care in this day and age has to be radical, because we have to create it for ourselves, right? So my radical self-care starts every single day, right? It starts by being hydrated. It starts by having a notebook with me when I know that I'm entering predominantly white spaces or spaces where I don't feel included. I need something that I could just doodle on, right? I need something that's there that I can distract myself if it gets too much. I exercise. That's a place for me of radical self-care. I spend time with my children and my friends and my family. And so what do you do, right? This is a rhetorical question, but what do you do in that space of healing? And I would hope that part of what you do is find spaces in community and find spaces with people, because again, it's only through that community that we can actually start to heal. And so for me, healing means wholeness. It means reconnecting to that essence that was lost a long time ago and figuring out who I am while acknowledging the intergenerational trauma that still lives in me, but so do the beauty of my ancestors. So I actually don't want to throw all of that away, right? I want to hold on to the good, and I want to question the other things that don't feel so good. And that's how I find my core, and that's how I find my essence. And again, it's a lifelong journey. And so I just want to introduce to you 5 tenets of when I say trauma-informed practice from a diversity, equity, inclusion lens. This is what I mean. And this is what I also talk about in the paper and the book that I write. And so when we talk about safety, I don't know how many of you have shown up in spaces and somebody has said to you, don't worry, this is a safe space. As soon as somebody tells me the space is safe, I start to question if it is even safe, because I wonder, like, how do you know what makes me safe, right? Like, you can't claim safety for me. You can say, this is a brave space and I want us to work towards safety. But unless I know what makes you feel safe and you know what makes me feel safe, right? So for safety, for me, is physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological. It's a do no harm. And I'm not claiming it. I am working in collaboration to build safety, which requires the naming of the connection between intergenerational and systemic trauma and individual well-being. Really important to think about, because I think safety is one of those words that we use all the time, but we actually don't know what we mean. So my question to you, another rhetorical, is what does it mean to feel safe? What does feeling safe mean to you? The next one is trust. So another big one, right? That personally in my own life, I've had a really hard time with, because I never really learned how to trust. For me, trust was always conditional, right? Do this, I'll trust you. Do that, I'll trust you. I didn't have boundaries, as I shared growing up. So I didn't really understand what it meant to have boundaries, right? And so for me, a lot about trustworthiness is about transparency, right? It's about making things clear. It's about maintaining purposeful boundaries. And I hope to embody it. Like when we started our talk today, I said to you, this is what's going to happen. That I'm being transparent. I don't want to give you any, I don't want to surprise you or scare you with anything. I want to tell you exactly what's going to happen, because trauma is about the unpredictability, right? The definition of trauma is that it overwhelms our ability to cope and that it's unpredictable, right? And so how do you make spaces more predictable, more clear, and more transparent? The next tenet that I want to share is choice. And that's a big one too, because I think sometimes when working with our clients or even with ourselves, we don't give each other and we don't give one another or even ourselves choice, right? It's more of a dictate or a mandate. And so when we also talk about healing practices, for example, how are we honoring the diversity of healing practices, offering and inviting choice? Even I'm being in the spirit of transparency, like even as I'm reading through these, I feel myself sort of like opening up and imagining what a world, what an organization, what my own home looks like when we lean into these principles, right? Because they're not only just for an organization, they're for my lives. I work with my kids around this too, right? And so I want us to not stay on a high level, but really think about what this might look like for our own homes. And so collaboration, maximizing collaboration and sharing power. Equity is about sharing power. I'm sure you've heard that word a million times, particularly in the last 2 years, right? And so how are equity and inclusive-based approaches and interventions being communicated How is inclusion being practiced and honored in decision-making? Right? So you're not just telling somebody if they like a decision or agree with the decision, but you're actually including them as part of the process. I love collaboration because I know that my lens is just one lens and my experience in this world is just one experience. And so how can I bring people in my community to create more wholeness and a wider lens for others? And finally, empowerment and voice. And I think empowerment is a very interesting word because oftentimes, particularly in the helping field, we say like, it'll be in mission statements like this organization empowers people or we empower people. And if you think about that and you don't unpack that, you could see that that word empowerment comes from a place of hierarchy. I can't empower you, right? I don't have that power. I can work in collaboration with you for you to empower yourself. And so sometimes I think the helping profession has lived in this space of hierarchy and in a place of sort of minimizing people that have had mental health issues or people that are from marginalized identities, instead of working in collaboration, identifying strengths, prioritizing building skills in a community that promote survivor organizational healing and growth, right? So everyone has a value to add, not just the directors, not just the person with the degree, but everyone has a value to add, and every voice should have the opportunity to be heard. And so these are all five of these are sort of like my vision for my work, my vision for my home, my vision for my community. And look, I'm human, I'm fallible. So it's not like I do this all the time, but it becomes a template for how I live and how I engage in relationship in order to heal and move the work forward. And when I say the work, I mean the work of trauma-informed practice from a social justice lens. I mean the work of understanding that trauma is a disconnection from the self. I mean the work of understanding that intergenerational trauma does not put us in a place of deficit, but actually puts us in an opportunity to see how our ancestors live in us in ways that are helpful and sometimes not so helpful. Right? And so this is another rhetorical question, how can we, right? How can we together build on the key elements of a trauma-informed social justice approach in your practice to ensure the positive mental health of others? And how can we advocate for this approach, right? Like some of you may be thinking there and be like, Laura, this is great, but like, how do I walk into my agency tomorrow and say, you know what, I want a trauma-informed social justice approach? And so what I say to that question is that one of the things that has really helped me is having to find my influence. That I know as a professor that worked for many years in a predominantly white institution, I can't change higher education, right? I can't change that structure. But what I can change is I can change my classroom. I can sit in a meeting and I can raise my hand and ask a question, and I can name when somebody might have said a hurt or a microaggression. Right? I can be in my sphere of influence where I have agency. I can build community with people who will also speak up, right? And so I want us all to think about, what is your influence, right? In my home with my children, we have conversations around race and we have conversations around gender all the time, not all the time, but we have it enough where it becomes sort of, this is what we do, right? And so how do you also do that? I would like to switch the word safe to brave, right? So I want you to create brave spaces where people can show up, where they can tell parts of their story, where they can lean into discomfort, where they can name, you know what, as an adolescent, I was using all the time because I just didn't know what else to do. But now I realize that that's probably not aligned with my values. So how do I switch it up? Right? I always say, like, I can't convince anyone to do this work, but I can invite them to the table through the place of love. And that's how we started today. And so what comes to mind with me when we talk about intergenerational trauma, when we talk about racial inequity, when we talk about racial trauma and how to move forward from a place of healing? Love, right? In the sense of a verb. Dialogue. How do we move into spaces of dialogue versus spaces of debate? right? Where we can honor curiosity. I use curiosity as a tool all the time. I ask questions. I try not to make assumptions. And instead, I say a lot like, what do you mean by that? I'm not sure I understand. Can you tell me more? I question my students about labels they put on clients when they don't connect them to intergenerational trauma or to systems of oppression. And I also have to do my own critical reflection. I have to be in my own therapy, right? I have to have my own quiet moments of accountability where I can think about ways that I can show up better. I use myself. I strive to come from a place of compassion. And when I have the opportunity, I step into spaces as a place of disruption so the status quo doesn't get elevated. And so individuals aren't seen as broken or unstable or wild, but are actually seen as people who are affected by intergenerational trauma and systems of oppression. And so this is what I hope for you today, that you were able to learn something or question something or think more deeply about something or lean into your own story as a place of healing. And so I want to make sure that we have time for questions. But before we do that and I stop sharing my screen, I'd love for you to just, before you leave today, before we sign out, just put one word in the chat about what you learned, what you thought more deeply about, what resonated with you. And I'm not going to grade you bad if you do more than one word. Of course, you can do more than one word. But if you just want to do one word, you can do one word too. And so I'm going to stop my screen and I'm going to thank you for listening to me for 45 minutes almost. And I'd love to open up the space. So Clara can take questions and I'd be happy to answer them. I also have a website where you can find a lot of my work and some of my talks, and I can put that in my book if you're interested at all, but I can put that in the chat too.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing a lot of people talk about the idea of a brave space, radical self-care, the weathering effect. There's a lot of just a lot of great things coming up in the chat. So I'm going to let folks predictability, transparency, and choice helping to as a help for trauma. Yeah, there's just a lot of folks sharing what they've learned in a great way. I'd love for, and hopefully they won't get lost as folks are sharing, if folks are willing to put their questions in the chat. We have a lot of folks, so I want to see if folks can put their questions there. But we don't have any, there weren't any questions that were asked during the presentation that I saw. So we don't have any in the queue.
I think Frank has.
But yeah, we can, Frank, if you, oh, hang on, let me.
Hey, are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes, we are.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Clara and Laura. It was a great presentation. I just wanted to ask, hopefully this isn't, too specific or anything, but, I am a cisgender white male, and I'm married to an immigrant, right? A child of immigrants, a first generation American, whose English is not their first language, right? And obviously their experience has been a lot different than mine. And I constantly try to seek ways to be empathetic and understand that experience. And as we aim to start a family, like how I can do that as well with our children, right? So any tips you can have to kind of do that in a more effective way would be really helpful.
Well, Frank, I just want to thank you for being vulnerable and asking that question. Like, that is already a step, right? The fact that you are curious and looking for knowledge and, really vulnerable about that is awesome. So yeah, cheers to that. I think that, I mean, I could say so many, this is a longer conversation, but I think that one of the ways is to get first curious about yourself, like ways in which you may like what your own journey is, right? In terms of your own identity. That's the first, like, I think sometimes when we're partnering with people from different identities or different backgrounds, we tend to be like, oh, I want to understand you better. I want to understand you better. Instead of saying, first, I need to understand myself, right? And then we can do that together. Right, if that makes sense, because you'll never understand your partner's experience, just like I'll never understand my partner's experience, but I can be in partnership and grow together in the space of learning and knowledge. So I would also sort of, think about what you two are reading or watching together and then dialoguing about it, right? Thinking about how your own journey as a white male and what that has been for you and how that may have stopped you from being inclusive in the past, right? And so I think Bell Hooks has a beautiful book called All About Love, which I would also suggest reading. It's just beautiful and it speaks to partnership in all sorts of ways. So those are sort of keys. Those are sort of things I would mention. I'm not sure if those help or not.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So another question, there's a couple questions coming in. So thank you everyone for putting their questions, for sending their questions in. One is, can you speak about the differences between trauma-informed care and the newer concept of healing-centered engagement?
So many words and acronyms and labeled. Healing-centered engagement, trauma-informed practice or care. I mean, I would say to that, like, I'd like for us to move outside of labels. And when we see those labels, I question, like, what does this mean, right? So like healing-centered spaces are spaces I'm thinking of, and I don't know the formal definitions, but spaces where healing takes place. Trauma-informed care is a system of care that takes into account, in my book, intergenerational, socio-political, interpersonal traumas and makes that the lens. And so I guess what I would do instead of comparing the differences is understanding how those two practices really uphold healing and justice in their own individual ways. I think right now we're in a moment where people are trying to add different acronyms and labels and names to similar things. And so for me, it's more important when I hear these different phrases from the people is to ask them, so tell me what you mean by that. And then my mind as sort of an academic and somebody who's always curious is like, okay, well, what is missing, right? So what's missing from this practice? Who is not at the table? What is not at the table? So that is what I would say.
Great, thank you. Another question, since historical trauma manifests itself in dynamics within many oppressed communities and we do things to each other, can you talk about the power of forgiveness? And I also want to, somebody asked a question about whether the resources can be included when the recording is sent out. I have been making notes of the books that were shared in the chat and the recommendations. We will definitely be including those in the follow-up email. But if you would like to save the chat, you can also do so by going to the three dots above where you type your message in, and there should be an option to save the chat if anybody would like to do that. Just wanted to speak to that really quickly.
Can you read the question again? Because I have a few thoughts in my head. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Since historical trauma manifests itself in dynamics within many oppressed communities and we do things to each other, can you talk about the power of forgiveness?
Yeah. I mean, forgiveness and acceptance for me has been things that I've been thinking about. And I say thinking about because I'm still thinking about it. Like, one, yes, intergenerational trauma within communities, particularly I know that from my own community, right? The anti-Black sentiment within the Latinx community is real, right? I've written papers on colorism as well. That's real. And that's a whole other topic. But I think, like, for me, I've worked really hard to be in a place of acceptance for who people are and then creating my boundaries around that, right? So like, if I accept somebody for who they are, right? Understanding the limitations of that relationship, understanding for me, right? If I do that, I'm able to then work with them in a way that works for me. And this could be somebody as close to me as a parent, right? So I like to think about acceptance, and then understanding that when I am in that place of acceptance, forgiveness comes, but I can still have boundaries, if that makes sense. Like for me, as I shared with you, I didn't know I didn't know what a boundary was. And so accepting and then creating those boundaries from the place of love, because it's always from the place of love for me, is where I go to. Understanding, and I check myself because I'm still tight and angry, and I haven't reached that point yet. And so what work do I need to do in order to be of that place of acceptance, and then the boundaries that I need to create from that, if that makes sense. And that I'm a work in progress.
Great, thank you. There's a ton of questions coming in, so I apologize